In a world filled with noise, can the silent cries of the heart still be heard? The sun was high over Capernaum, casting a golden glow across the lively marketplace. It was the busiest part of the day, and the streets were brimming with activity. Merchants filled every corner, their stalls overflowing with goods from every corner of the region. Spices so vibrant they seemed to tint the air, bolts of richly dyed fabric, and baskets laden with fruit so ripe their aroma mingled with the salt of the nearby sea. Fishmongers shouted out their prices, their tables heaped with the day's catch from the Sea of Galilee, scales shimmering under the midday light. Amidst the symphony of noise, Jesus and his disciples walked quietly, a calm presence in the midst of the chaotic throng. The disciples, though accustomed to the energy of such gatherings, felt uneasy, for they had become familiar with how people sought out Jesus. Here in Capernaum, people had heard tales of his miracles, of his teachings that stirred the hearts of the lowly and confounded the wise. As they moved through the crowd, a woman with a sick child in her arms approached, pleading for healing. Without hesitation, Jesus stopped, laying a gentle hand on the child, whispering words only the mother could hear. The disciples watched, some whispering among themselves, wondering what had brought them to this noisy, crowded place. Peter, ever the watchful protector, stayed close to Jesus, keeping an eye on those who reached out with hands full of hope, fear, or desperation. As they passed through a particularly narrow alleyway, Jesus suddenly stopped, his gaze softening as he looked toward a corner almost hidden from view. There, in the shade cast by the fruit stalls, sat an elderly woman. She was hunched over, clutching a cracked clay jar, her face obscured by the shadow of her tattered shawl. Her clothes, once vibrant, had faded to dull earth tones, and her hands, weathered by years of toil, held the jar tightly as if it were her last possession. She did not call out to him. She did not even lift her gaze, as though resigned to her own invisibility. "Do you see her?" Jesus asked his disciples, his voice filled with quiet intensity. They followed his gaze, unsure of what he saw that they did not. The marketplace was full of people in need. She was just one of many. John, the disciple closest to Jesus' heart, noticed something more, a deep sadness in her posture, a resignation that spoke of pain long endured. "She seems alone, Lord," he said softly, not fully understanding but feeling the weight of her silent sorrow. "More than alone," Jesus replied, his eyes filled with a compassion that was both tender and unwavering. He began walking toward her, and the disciples exchanged puzzled glances before following. As they drew closer, the woman looked up, startled, her sunken eyes widening as she realized who was approaching. For a moment, her expression shifted, and a glimmer of hope sparked in her gaze, as if she dared to believe she might still be seen. Jesus knelt beside her, lowering himself to her level in a gesture of profound humility. "Dear woman," he said softly, his voice like a balm, "may I sit with you for a while?" The woman's lips trembled, her weathered hands clutching her jar even tighter as she nodded, unable to find her voice. In that moment, surrounded by the noise of the marketplace, an invisible stillness descended over them. The disciples watched, feeling something sacred unfolding before them, something they could not yet understand but knew would linger in their hearts forever. With Jesus beside her, the woman sat in silence, her breathing unsteady as she tried to find the courage to speak. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was barely audible, a whisper that seemed almost lost beneath the clamor of the marketplace. But Jesus listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face, as though her words were the only sound that mattered. She began to share her story, piece by fragile piece, her words halting and fractured, like someone trying to draw water from a well that had long since run dry. She told of her husband, a fisherman, a man whose laughter once echoed along the shores of the Sea of Galilee. She spoke of their children, 3 little souls who had filled their modest home with laughter and song, who had once made her life feel rich and full beyond measure. But life, she explained, had not been kind. One by one, her children had been taken from her by illness, a relentless shadow that crept into their home, leaving her with empty arms and an emptier heart. Her husband, unable to bear the weight of their losses, had fallen into despair and sickness, his health withering as grief overtook him. She had watched as he, too, faded away, leaving her utterly alone. She spoke of long empty nights filled with the sound of her own sobs, and of mornings that felt like an endless burden, another day to survive in a world that had turned its back on her. Her words faltered, and she lowered her gaze, her voice breaking as she spoke the words she had never dared to say aloud. "No one sees me anymore," she murmured. "It's as if I don't exist. I walk these streets, but I'm invisible like a ghost. I cry out to God, but it feels as though even He does not hear." Her hands trembled as she clutched her jar, as though it were the last piece of herself she had left to hold on to. The disciples, standing around them, felt the weight of her sorrow, a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into the very air around them. They had heard stories of suffering before, seen many in need, but never had they encountered a loneliness so profound, a pain so quietly endured. Jesus reached out and placed His hand on hers, a touch that conveyed more than words could ever express. "Your cries are not unheard," He said softly, His voice filled with a compassion that seemed to wrap around her like a warm embrace. "God has seen every tear, felt every ache in your heart. You are not alone, dear woman." The woman looked at him, her eyes filling with tears, her lips parting in a silent gasp as she clung to his words, letting them fill the empty spaces within her. For the first time in years she felt seen, truly seen, and a warmth began to unfurl within her, a fragile hope kindling in the ashes of her despair. The disciples watched, their hearts stirred by the tenderness in Jesus' gaze, by the way He held this woman's pain as though it were His own. In that moment they realized that they had been given a glimpse into something sacred, a love that could reach into the deepest darkness, a love that did not turn away from suffering but moved toward it with open arms. They felt the weight of His words settle over them, a call to see the unseen, to hear the unheard, to become vessels of the same compassion that filled their Master's heart. After a long silence, as the woman sat in the gentle comfort of His presence, Jesus looked up at His disciples, His expression serious, thoughtful. "Do you understand?" He asked them, His voice gentle but carrying an undeniable weight. The disciples exchanged glances, some nodding, others still processing the depth of what they had just witnessed. James, always contemplative, was the first to speak. "Master, we thought we did." But hearing her story, he trailed off, searching for the right words, realizing that their understanding of compassion had been shallow, that they had seen suffering but had not truly felt it. Jesus nodded, sensing their struggle to grasp the full meaning of His actions. He knew that some lessons needed more than words, that they needed to be lived, experienced, woven into the very fabric of one's heart. "Let me tell you a story," He said, and His voice softened, taking on a lilting rhythm that drew them closer, inviting them into a world of parables and hidden truths. He spoke of a shepherd who had a flock of 100 sheep, each one dear to him, each voice distinct, each face known by heart. One evening, as the shepherd gathered his flock into the fold, he heard a faint cry, a sound so soft it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But the shepherd, attuned to each of his sheep, recognized the bleat of a small lamb, one too weak to call out properly. Leaving behind the safety of the fold, the shepherd searched the dark hills, his heart guided by the memory of that weak, trembling sound. He found the little lamb lying in the shadows, too weak to stand, its body frail and trembling. Without hesitation, he lifted it onto his shoulders, carrying it back to the fold, whispering gentle words to soothe its fear. The shepherd, Jesus explained, his eyes meeting each of his disciples in turn, heard what no one else could. He was attuned to every one of his flock, no matter how small or weak. In the same way, God is attuned to each one of us, to every cry, even the ones we think are too small to matter. The disciples listened, their faces softening as the story sank in, as they understood the profound truth hidden within his words. In the depths of their hearts, they felt the stirring of a new calling, a call to listen more deeply, to be attuned to the silent cries that often went unheard, to become like the shepherd who did not overlook even the weakest, most vulnerable member of his flock. The next morning, as the sun rose over Capernaum, casting long, soft rays across the town, Jesus and his disciples returned to the marketplace. The noise and chaos were unchanged, the familiar cacophony of voices, the clinking of coins, the vibrant calls of merchants advertising their wares. But as they moved through the crowd, a young woman stood off to the side, watching them with a quiet intensity. Her name was Miriam, and she had overheard Jesus' words the previous day. The way he had comforted the elderly woman had stirred something in her, a longing she had not even realized she harbored. Miriam was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, a man respected in the town for his shrewd business sense and substantial fortune. Outwardly, her life appeared easy and secure, but her heart was heavy. Her family, for all their wealth, was cold, ruled by strict order and appearances. Miriam had grown up in a household that valued control and discipline over warmth and compassion. She had learned early on to keep her emotions hidden, her voice quiet, her spirit subdued. But the silent cries in her heart had grown louder with each passing year, and as she watched Jesus and his disciples, she felt drawn to them. With a hesitant step, she approached Jesus, her gaze lowered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Teacher," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper, "is it true that God hears even the silent cries?" Jesus turned to her, his eyes filled with a gentleness that felt like sunlight warming her soul. "Yes, Miriam," he said, his voice steady and kind. "God hears every cry, no matter how quiet, even those that remain locked within the heart." Her eyes filled with tears and she struggled to hold them back. Her mind raced with memories of loneliness, of nights spent longing for a love she could not name, of feeling like a prisoner in her own home. She wanted to believe him, but her heart had been hardened by years of silence. "But how can that be?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How could he hear me when I am not allowed to speak? When I have learned to keep everything hidden?" Jesus took her hand, holding it gently. "Miriam," he said, "God does not wait for you to speak aloud. He knows your heart and every longing within it. He is the friend who listens to the unspoken, the one who walks with you even when you feel alone." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You are seen even in silence. And you are loved even when you feel unworthy." Miriam's tears flowed freely now, each one a release of years of hidden sorrow. She clung to his hand, feeling a warmth, a presence she had never known. In that moment she felt her heart begin to soften, a healing she could not explain. The disciples looked on, moved by her vulnerability, by the way Jesus held her pain with such tenderness. They began to see that compassion was not just a feeling but a powerful force that could reach into the deepest parts of the human heart and bring life where there had been only silence. In the days that followed, Jesus and his disciples continued to visit the marketplace, each time pausing to speak with those who seemed lost or burdened, those whose faces bore the quiet weight of sorrow or weariness. Jesus had a way of seeing past the surface, of noticing the hidden pain in a person's eyes, the unspoken stories that lingered in the lines of their faces. He moved through the market with a gentle purpose, greeting each person with the same kindness, the same open-hearted presence that left them feeling seen, understood, and valued. The disciples, inspired by his example, began to practice this new way of seeing. They noticed people they might once have overlooked: a beggar with a twisted foot who had given up hope of being healed, a woman carrying a deep grief that had rendered her almost mute, a child hiding in the shadows, afraid to approach the crowds. Each one had a story, a silent cry that had gone unheard by the world, and as they listened, they found their own hearts expanding, filled with a love they had never experienced. One afternoon, as they sat together in the shade of a tree, Peter spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Master," he said, "I have always thought that compassion was about meeting physical needs. feeding the hungry, healing the sick, comforting the brokenhearted. But now, I feel as though I am learning to hear with new ears, to see with new eyes. There is so much more beneath the surface, isn't there? Jesus smiled, a warm light in his eyes. Yes, Peter, he replied. True compassion goes beyond the visible, beyond what we can touch or heal with our hands. It is about listening with the heart, being present with those who feel unseen, and letting them know they are loved. This is the kind of love that transforms, that brings healing not only to the body but to the soul. The disciples nodded, their faces thoughtful, each one feeling the weight of his words. They realized that this was a call to a deeper way of life, a way of seeing that required them to look past appearances, to become vessels of a love that went beyond human understanding. And as they looked at each other, they felt a new sense of purpose, a quiet resolve to carry this love into every corner of the world. One day, as they were walking through the market, the disciples encountered a young man named Eliab, a wealthy merchant's son who had grown up surrounded by luxury and privilege. He was well-dressed, his clothes rich with the colors and fabrics that marked him as someone of importance. Eliab had heard of Jesus and his disciples, and though he was curious, he was also skeptical. As he watched them stop to speak with beggars and lepers, he felt a mix of disdain and disbelief. Approaching them with a confident stride, he addressed Peter, his tone laced with a hint of mockery. "Why waste your time on those who offer nothing in return?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "These people, these beggars and outcasts, they are nothing more than burdens. What can they give you that is worth your attention?" Peter, caught off guard by the man's arrogance, felt anger rise within him. He clenched his fists, ready to respond with a harsh retort, but before he could speak, Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, calming him. Turning to Eliab, Jesus spoke with a gentleness that diffused the tension. "Eliab," he said, his voice steady, "are you not also in need of love, though you do not ask for it?" Eliab's confident facade faltered, a flicker of confusion passing over his face. He had not expected such a response, had not anticipated that his own heart would be laid bare. Uncomfortable, he shifted his gaze, feeling an unfamiliar vulnerability. I don't need anything," he stammered, attempting to regain his composure. "I have everything I could want." Jesus smiled, his eyes filled with compassion. "Perhaps, Eliab," he said softly, "you have all that money can buy. But true riches are found not in possessions, but in the love that fills the heart. It is a love that sees beyond wealth and status, that embraces even the weakest and poorest. This is the love that gives meaning to life." Eliab was silent, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. He had never considered that his wealth might be a barrier, that there could be something greater than his material success. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his expression troubled. The disciples watched him go, sensing that a seed had been planted, one that might one day lead him to seek the truth. As they continued their journey, Jesus took the opportunity to teach his disciples through a parable. They had gathered on a quiet hillside, away from the noise and bustle of the town, and the warm breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and earth. Sitting in a circle around him, the disciples listened as he spoke of a seed sown in good soil, a seed that grew in silence, unseen beneath the surface, until it finally bloomed into something beautiful and strong. "The kingdom of God," Jesus explained, "is like this seed. It grows quietly, hidden from sight, but it is always at work, transforming hearts, bringing life where there was once only barrenness." He paused, letting the imagery sink in. In the same way, love works quietly in the heart, unseen but powerful. It does not demand recognition, but it is faithful, steady, and persistent. And in time it will bear fruit. The disciples reflected on his words, understanding that the love Jesus spoke of was not something that needed to be proven or displayed. It was a quiet force, working in the unseen places, healing wounds, restoring hope, bringing life where there had been only sorrow. And as they looked at each other, they realized that they had become part of this love, that it was growing within them, shaping them into people who could carry his message to the world. The days turned into weeks, and the disciples found themselves transformed by the lessons they had learned. Their encounters with the elderly woman, with Miriam, and even with Eliab had opened their eyes to the hidden cries that surrounded them, the silent pain that lingered in the hearts of those they met. They had learned to listen with compassion, to see beyond appearances, to be present with those who felt unseen. And in doing so, they had found a new sense of purpose, a calling that went beyond their previous understanding. They began to move through the world with a quiet attentiveness, noticing the unspoken stories in the faces of strangers, the hidden sorrows that could be eased by a kind word or a gentle touch. They were learning day by day to embody the love Jesus had shown them, to become vessels of the compassion that had changed their own hearts. And as they looked back on their journey, they realized that this love was not just for the broken and the weary but for everyone, even those who seemed whole and untroubled. One evening, Jesus invited the disciples and the people they had met, the elderly woman, Miriam, and even Eliab, to join him by the lakeshore for a shared meal. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water, and the air was filled with the soft murmur of voices and laughter. Each person brought their own story, their own journey of healing and transformation, and as they shared their experiences, they found a sense of community, a bond forged by love and compassion. The elderly woman, who had once felt invisible, now sat among friends, her face softened by peace and gratitude. Miriam, who had lived in silence for so long, found her voice, speaking freely for the first time in her life. And Eliab, who had begun to question the emptiness of his wealth, sat quietly listening, his heart touched by the stories of those he had once dismissed. Each person had been transformed by the love that Jesus had shown them, a love that saw beyond their pain, that embraced them in their brokenness. As the evening drew to a close, Jesus stood, his eyes filled with a quiet strength, a love that radiated like a gentle flame. The disciples and those gathered looked up, their faces illuminated by the warmth of his gaze. "My friends," he said, his voice steady and tender, "remember this. Every heart matters to God, even those hidden in the shadows. Let your love be the light that reaches into that darkness, listening to the cries that others ignore. For it is in this love that you will find true purpose, and in this love that you will truly follow me." The disciples looked at each other, a new resolve shining in their eyes. They knew that they had been called to something greater than themselves, a mission to carry this love into every corner of the world, to listen to the silent cries, to see the unseen, to be a light in the lives of those who felt forgotten. And as they gazed out over the faces before them, they felt a sense of peace, a deep and abiding joy that would sustain them for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed the power of love, a love that transformed, healed, and restored, and they knew that they would carry it with them wherever they went for as long as they lived. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.